Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. I'm grateful to share some time with author and professor Margarita Mooney Clayton. Margarita is an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. She's also taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Yale University, Pepperdine University, and Princeton University. She's also been a visiting fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University. She's earned her bachelor's in psychology from Yale University and then went on to a master's and Ph.D. in sociology from Princeton University. And in 2016, she founded the Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring American culture through beauty, liberal arts, education, and worship. Scala's students, programs, conferences, and online activities have led her to write two books, such as The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, and The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. And that's what the book that threw us into this conversation. She's spoken at Hillsdale College, the Catholic University of America, the Society for Classical Learning, and the Action Institute. She's led workshops on the vocation to teach beauty in education at various K-12 classical schools and Christian churches. Been interviewed on numerous times about her education and beauty, including Eric Metaxas's radio show, Ken Meyer's Mars Hill Audio, and the Classical Learning Test podcast. Marguerite is the daughter of a Cuban refugee and an Irish-American father. She was educated in a mix of public and Catholic schools from K to 12 and around her family dinner table. She's passionate about supporting families, houses of worship, schools, and educating the next generation of America in beauty and wisdom. Dr. Clayton, thank you for sharing time with us. What a gift.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I'm amazed when I read through all of that. And I had to read it because there was so much and so many different places that you've had the privilege. I won't make you say your favorite, but Princeton is home for you right now as a professor. What do you love about Princeton? That's where you did your PhD and master's work. But what do you love about Princeton?
Well, Princeton is a beautiful campus that's a manageable size. It's not a mega university. And so what I love about Princeton is that the beauty of the architecture, the artwork in the art museum, the opportunities for worship, and then the people that you meet, you'll run into them in the coffee shop because it feels like a community, like a family. And so Princeton University, people often don't realize, decided never to really build professional schools. So they have undergraduates and PhD programs. But unlike other universities, which for good reasons have very large law schools, medical schools, Princeton doesn't have that. So it feels like a little intellectual and spiritual retreat, really.
Yeah. What a wonderful place for you to do the work that you're doing. I can't wait to talk about the book. I can't wait to talk about Scala Foundation and your work there. I was introduced to your work through a book called The Liberating Arts. And it's just a little book that has a collection of essays. That's how I found my way to you. And as I was telling you before, I came to the Scala Foundation kind of through that reading. I didn't have any idea, but I felt like I'd walked through a wardrobe door into this oasis. The work you're doing there is amazing. So before we dive into your story, because I want to pull on some threads and get some backdrop, but just tell us what the Scala Foundation is, the work that you're doing, and then we'll circle back to that in a bit.
I started the Scala Foundation as a nonprofit in 2016. And its vision is really to restore meaning and purpose to American culture. And the way that we do that is by promoting a liberal arts view of education and integrated curriculum, and also through working with cultured creators, people bringing the great traditions in sacred art and music to the fore today and connecting them to educators. And also ultimately integrating all of that into a life of gratitude that is expressed in worship, which used to be understood as the glue that would bind a society together. Who do we love ultimately? How do we bind all of these things together? So I pursue Scala's student programs, conferences, opportunities to hear from artists about their latest work, both in Princeton as well as now increasingly in Oxford. My husband is English, so we go there more. And Scala has really enriched my work as a professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I teach students from a variety of backgrounds who are eager to think through the contemporary problems in our culture from a theological, artistic, and ultimately an integrated humanist lens, and bring the best of our traditions to renew our culture, which for many people has been plunged into darkness and division and leading to a lot of despair amongst young people.
Yeah. I love that you say that you're setting out to restore meaning to education. And I think this is why I felt like I'd walk through Lewis's wardrobe. And then when I heard your voice, I was just grateful to God because of the long preparation that he's had you in for the work you're doing, but also the fire that he's given you. There's a potency to your voice that is really important for all of us kind of coming of age in a very, what we would say is a disenchanted moment. But there's something really exciting because people are starting to realize that how we have imagined reality is insufficient for who we are as humans, and we're longing for something other, but we're looking for people who can help us aim rightly. And I think we'll come back to Scala Foundation because I think that's why your work is so vital to resource education and the arts, and there's so much work to do there. But I'm curious, when I was reading your bio, I loved, you've taught here and here and here and here and been educated in all these wonderful places that we dream of being able to provide access to our kids and the people we love to have that kind of education. But you include your dining room table. And I loved that. You said, my education was K-12 and around the dining room table. Tell us about the dining room table growing up. I mean, you had this great mix of immigrant parents and this story. Take us back to your dining room table. What was it like sitting around the dining room table, and why did that make it to be a place of education for you?
Some of my earliest memories is being a young child sitting at the dining room table with my father, who was teaching me the basics of algebra when I was about 5 years old. And my father had gotten a master's degree in mathematics at the Catholic University of America, where he had met and married my mother, who was a Cuban refugee, came to the United States at the age of 20. And she was pursuing an undergraduate education very slowly because she was working full time. So they met at the chess club. Yes, my mother showed up to chess club at Catholic University of America in 1968. And how many women were there at chess club? One. And my dad invited her to play a game of chess, and she beat him. She never beat him ever again, but he was pretty hooked. So when they married and moved about an hour north of Washington, D.C. to Frederick County, Maryland, our home, which was a small townhouse, we experimented with all kinds of things outdoors. My dad had us doing yard work. He had us doing mathematics at the table. During our dinner conversations, he had the map of the periodic table of the elements or a map of the world and would give us quizzes. My mother, looking back, I realized my mother had only been in this country for a little bit over 10 years when I was born, and she was still learning the language and she was learning the culture. So everything that I brought home from school, she wanted to learn. She hadn't gone to school in this country. This wasn't her native language. She didn't know these novels. So my mother really learned alongside us. And in doing so, she taught us this love of learning. And because my father taught us as much as he also played with us, he taught us that the life of the intellect is beautiful and exciting, and that the wonder that we had, throwing sand at each other in the sandbox in the backyard of our little townhouse, that excitement could translate into a science experiment or the mathematical principles behind nature. So I tell this story because I know from having studied education in the United States and talked to so many educators that education is not fundamentally about having the most material resources. It's about having the right vision of the person, because my family and the schools that I went to, I can tell you, were not rich in material resources, but they were living out a tradition that had been passed on. And I've been honored to be part of the dining room education of my brother's children who were homeschooled, such as through classical conversations. Believe me, I thought it was crazy when they decided to homeschool.
Mm.
But it gave me the opportunity to do what my mother did, which is to sit next to them. I actually read some of their books, which I hadn't read the Westminster Confession, and I hadn't read some of the history books. They're reading Augustine's Confessions in the 8th grade. I mean, how great is that? Now, I happen to know the scholar, Peter Brown, who wrote the introduction to that book, but here are these young people being exposed to these great ideas. So now what I see happening in education is so many young people who are being exposed to the ideas bring it back to their families.
Mm. I love that. What a funny. I'm taking a group of pastors through that version of Brown's version of Confessions right now. We just did that call this morning, and it's amazing how many people in their adult life have not encountered that kind of writing. And I love that that's how you grew up, and that there was that atmosphere around the family table. What were you dreaming about as a young girl at that dining room table? I mean, here you are now teaching. You're a professor at Princeton. You have this deep passion for education and beauty. When you go back like 12 years old, what would you have been
Yeah.
dreaming about?
Well, it's kind of funny. I think I dreamed about being able to do everything my 3 older brothers could do. So much so that when I had to pick a monologue to act out in the 8th grade, so I was 13, I picked a warrior saint, Saint Joan of Arc. And I acted out her monologue being burned at the stake. So I had this thirst for kind of conquest and a passion for the truth and this confidence that I could do just about anything. Now, let me tell you, that confidence and that gusto and that ganas, as we call in Spanish, got killed in high school. I'm not entirely sure why, but I do think a lot of girls go through a deep crisis in their teenage years. And for me, high school was absolutely the worst years of my life. I wasn't challenged intellectually, I wasn't growing spiritually, nothing was clicking. It was a miracle that I got out of high school and got into Yale because I just happened to do well on standardized tests and good at creative writing. So I had just enough to push me in. And then Yale really changed my life for the better, for the most part. But I do the work I do today because I deeply sympathize with young people who go from having so much confidence and so much energy and then lose it
Mm.
and don't know how to get it back.
Mm. Yeah, it's wonderful. I love that fire. It's cool, that story of Joan of Arc, that was the heroine, for you there. Because when I listened to you speak, I listened to a couple lectures just through the Scala Foundation, and I was so grateful that you have that fight and that fire in you, because the restoring or recovering a meaning in education, there's a ton of work to be done. It's the rubble, and I think the weight, the dust of death. If you go back to Os Guinness and some others that have said, like, the reality of our culture today, there's a lot of work to do ahead. And so it's cool. I always love how God prepares us in advance, in that broad education and that really true liberal arts formation that you had, that fire. It was all aiming, right, unknowingly at this, what would be today the Scala Foundation. And you gave us just a glimpse of it, in restoring the meaning and purpose to education. I want to ask, if you can, if you're willing to help us, because we talk about this all the time, about our disenchanted Western world and that loss of a meaningful backdrop. And I think it's what happens in high school, that you lose that kind of sloth can set in, because you lose, why am I here? What is the aim of my life? That's not given to us. There's not a portrait or a vision of the graduate that's held up. That's not the norm for so much of culture. Can you help trace that loss of meaning in our context? And how did we arrive at this place today where you're saying we need a foundation that exists to restore meaning in education?
Well, I see two issues, and I think they're related. One is an increasing emphasis that education has to prepare people with a particular skill set that's going to be valuable in the marketplace. Now, I'm not against skills in education. I'll get back to that. But that can't be the only end of education. Second, I think, is a loss of the sense of God truly being transcendent, being other, yet also being intimate to us. Much of 20th century theology has actually focused more on what are our ethical obligations to others in light of the Gospels, and less on what are our obligations to God in light of the Gospels, and then how does that shape us? So what I encounter with students is this thought that education should prepare them to get a job, preferably a well-paying job, and that the meaning of their life is the efforts they make to help the underdog, right? To rectify the problems of the world. But what's missing from that, right? And I think Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and so much psychology is now saying this, is affirming what Augustine says in his Confessions, that our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And even if you get that high-paying job and you're out serving the poor every weekend, you can still wonder why. Or just wait until you can't achieve all of that anymore. And you can't even find interior stillness. So this is what I was seeing. I was seeing students who were highly prepared, ready to succeed, and were actually doing a lot of good for others, but didn't have that set of practices and virtues that's going to sustain them in turning their attention constantly back to God. And ultimately, I just came to see that this is just something that I was taught when I was young, that I recovered throughout my life, and that if you don't have that sense that you are deeply loved for who you are, not for what you've achieved or not for even who you've helped, but simply because the world is a better place that you're in it. Because we all have to confront our failings, our weaknesses, and we can be tempted to give up. And so that's why I think that education. Now, the next question you're going to ask me is, well, what does it look like to restore meaning, purpose in education? I have thoughts on that too.
Yeah. Well, first, just I love that you are starting with recognizing reality and you're starting with this fundamental shift that's taking place. I first really encountered it thoughtfully through Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and just this idea that the immanent frame, we recognize that it's not sufficient, and that loss of transcendence is at the root of so much of the felt experience of, just apathy and that loss of meaning, the rip current against pursuing anything with excellence and beauty itself. And so I love hearing all of these different brilliant people really pointing and saying that loss of transcendence has cost us dearly. And it seems to be that Western culture, and I think this is where Taylor was pointing, is opening back up to an open transcendent posture that isn't willing to say like, okay, we'll name that God, but is willing to say that there's something beyond, and we have to recover that. You're at Princeton, and that view is there. Do you feel like at the academic institution level, is there an acknowledgement upstream that maybe that kind of secular humanist immanent frame perspective that has guided a lot of the 20th century, that there is a need to open up and to explore something more broadly? Do you feel that kind of tide shifting at those levels, or is there still a lot of push against that opening up to transcendence?
I would say I see, honestly, if you get people behind the scenes talking as human beings, they will tell you, and I've seen this at Princeton, I've seen it at Yale, I've heard it from directors of various of the Christian studies centers that have sprung up, mostly on state schools, secular campuses, that the massive amount of investment in therapy for students and in entertainment for students has not cracked the surface of the despair on campus. And so the positive trend I see is that on secular campuses, many campus ministries are thriving. They're able to access the space. I don't think it's like the 1980s when my dear friend Rick Schneider, who led the Rivendell Institute for many years at Yale until he passed away of ALS, he was actually told by his dean that he could not sit on campus and talk to a minister from InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which of course they can't regulate that, but they tried to, right? So they're not doing that anymore, because even the people who themselves are secular, or I think of a woman at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill who supported me. She said, listen, I don't entirely understand what it is that you're bringing to the students, because I'm not really a person of faith, but I sense something is happening, and I think that we really need this. So that, I think, is really positive. I would not say, however, Zach, that the fields, the academic disciplines on most campuses of English literature or history, philosophy, I don't think that those fields, by and large, are passing on the great traditions of literature. Like, how many people are reading Dante in English literature? And if they do they really encounter the theological, or are they trying to critique it from a modern lens? So now, of course, there are exceptions to this, no doubt. But because most of the universities where I've been prize scholarship, and scholarship means finding a new angle, then there aren't that many classes that are teaching students to receive and appreciate first the great riches of the humanistic tradition. We're trying to turn all of our undergraduates into little mini scholars, which I don't think is working very well. And what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of the stuff that people will write is putting a modern lens onto an earlier time, rather than teaching them, right? We care so much about diversity. And I think we should try to understand the great books on their own terms, at least first make an attempt. And how much do we really know about who Dante was? Or, and it's just people repeat sort of tropes, and I've seen this, for example, Yale University has a fantastic art collection, but the student leading the collection apologizes for the unabashedly Christian nature of the images, and essentially leads people to look at it as an artifact whose time has passed, but not as an artifact that can speak to us today. And that leads, I think, to this mentality of analyzing and critiquing, which isn't based on a proper understanding of the object. So what that leads to is you can say anything you want about anything, because the meaning of that piece of art or the piece of literature or any work is whatever you deem it to be, therefore it must be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's, I love that you have the vantage point that you have, both with students and just walking and meeting people in coffee shops at Princeton, but also with the faculty. And so that you have both of those views to hear those perspectives. And then I hear David Clayton in the backdrop, like analysis and synthesis and what, his great book, The Way of Beauty. So I think you're in such a fantastic position to help lead this effort. You mentioned how. That is the next question I want to ask. And then I've got to leave room for the book, because I want to celebrate and talk about your book. But for Scala Foundation, we know this is our moment. We know that the recovery effort is going to have to come via institutions and a recovery through institutions. How is Scala helping that recovery take place? Talk a little bit about the how.
So Scala helps through events and resources and training of educators. So we host, of course, all year long, we host groups for students, intimate, around the dining room table. I have students around my dining room table all the time for prayer, for discussion, for fellowship. Number one, my dining room table. Now, a few times a year, we also put on public events. And the ethos of our public events is to bring the best of scholarship together with the best of culture, music, and art. So we've had multiple conferences on the campus of Princeton Theological Seminary with world-renowned scholars. But at those events, for example, in our last two conferences on art, the sacred and the common good, we had choral morning prayer led by an excellent choir and everybody in the audience chanting the Psalms, alternating with the choir. So the music, we didn't go to the chapel, we did it in the conference room. And we decorated the bare walls of Princeton Theological Seminary with icons. Pardon me, I have bare walls. I'm not at home. If I was at home, I wouldn't have bare walls. We also took people into the amazing archives at Princeton Theological Seminary, where the archivist put together an exhibit of 1,500 years of the Bible. And guess what? You see, the Bible is a work of art. You can't help but be overwhelmed at the beauty of the Gospel of John from the 5th century Egypt, written in Greek, handwritten, right? With notes in Arabic on the side. And we go from that up to the present day, looking at Bibles from different parts of the world and opening it up to the illustration. So what I was trying to show people is that these ideas on art, the sacred, and the common good are participating in this tradition. So the campus of Princeton allows us to have beautiful events at the Princeton University Chapel. We just had our largest event ever on March 1st, 2024. We had 1,000 people, many of them young people, participating, not just listening, participating in a Vespers service based on a rite from England called the Sarum Vespers. Again, led by an internationally renowned choir visiting from the UK. David and I, my husband and I, commissioned art for the event. We had the artists there, but we had 1,000 people participating in a beautiful worship service. Now, of course, me, the academic, I said, look, we got to have a few talks beforehand. We have to get the history out there. We have to explain to people why we have sacred art. We need to help prepare them for how to participate in the music. So it was 1 hour of lectures and 1.5 hours of beauty. And it's that integrated kind of event that Scala wants to do. The resources include the books, which you've already mentioned. I published my teaching notes from a high school seminar on beauty online. And we have more of those resources coming. And frankly, what I'm really excited about is supporting the young composers and creators of sacred art. And we're doing that through partnerships with organizations whose mission it is to train young musicians and artists. So the Catholic Sacred Music Project and the Chichester School of Liturgical Art, where they have world-renowned master artists and composers training young people in this incredible craft so that they can bring it to your church and to your school, because this is how this great vision Scala has will multiply. It's through supporting the teachers and supporting the culture creators who are shaping the next generation.
Yeah. Wow. It's, I'm like cheering. I want to get up and cheer from my seats. Like what it takes, I just want to say this for everybody who's listening, but the amount of insight, the amount of perspective, the amount of theological rigor required to be a catalytic figure to start that kind of work aimed at that direction with the specific, very, very, very important circle around education and the arts. I'm cheering that on and just praising God again that you have had the opportunity to experience what you've experienced, but that you've made this turn and recognized our moment and created the Scala Foundation. So I'll talk about where you can find it, how you can support it, but it's an organization that as I look, I go on our landscape and horizon. It's one of those that you just say, if we could direct $1 billion, or Mackenzie Scott can hear this and add it to the list of incredible foundations to support it, it deserves our support, because that intersection of education and the arts is going to be so important for the recovery that needs to take place. Beauty is, in our view, essential to that. And so I want to make a move and a turn to the book, because you wrote the book, The Wounds of Beauty, and our entire team, I read it. It's 7 dialogues on art and education. I read it, was absolutely thrilled at the way that you brought together these conversations, these 7 dialogues. Our whole team is reading it now to get these conversations kind of embodied in us. So why write on beauty? You talk about the intellect, and I think I'm with you. Imagination precedes reason; it doesn't supersede it. So I'm glad you had an hour of lecture and an hour and a half of beauty. But you chose to write then and to bring the intellectual side to point to beauty. Why lead with beauty from your perspective?
Well, beauty was the topic in my teaching and writing on liberal arts education, frankly, that students wanted to hear the most about. And I didn't have an intellectual formation in debates on beauty. So I began to seek those resources and seek the people to guide me. So the book you're talking about, The Wounds of Beauty, is really the result of my own search to understand debates in beauty. Is there anything objective about beauty? Is beauty anything more than self-expression? What does it mean to say that beauty is somehow transcendent? Um, and so I did a whole lot of reading, and because I love to read, Zach, as you heard about my childhood, I would spend hours in the bedroom just reading. So I read everything I could on beauty, right? From Scruton to von Balthasar to David Bentley Hart, and I just kept going. But I thought, you know, I wanted to get these ideas out to people who are educators, who are parents, who aren't going to pick up von Balthasar's The Glory of the Lord or something, or aren't going to pick up Jacques Maritain, who's been one of my favorite intellectual companions, but whose work is dense philosophically. So I set out to create a book that would be an introduction to these ideas. And a lot of scholarship in the ancient world, right? If you think of Athens, it was dialogical. So I invited some of the best academics and culture creators in that book to talk to me about their understandings of beauty and how they live that in their educational pursuits, right? So how do we pass this on educationally? And how does that affect their craft, whether that craft is painting, poetry, cheese making, um, or visual art. So that was the vision behind that. But ultimately, to tell you the truth, Zach, I followed an intuition. I followed an intuition that what I was seeing with the students was a spiritual hunger for authentic beauty. And that if I dove into this topic, I would be able to bring this beauty back into education more, which has been the project of my life. Along the way, you haven't mentioned this to your listeners yet, or maybe you don't know, but along the way, I met my husband. I only met my husband 3 years ago. So 5 years into the Scala venture, I met David Clayton, and we married about 1 year later. So we've been married now for 2 years. And many of the activities that we were doing independently, we're now doing more together, which has enriched, of course, so much, both of our vocations. And I'm incredibly grateful to God for my late vocation to marriage. It's been a great joy and an overwhelming kind of overflowing of our life together through our work in Scala.
Yeah, we could have an entire second episode just talking about how did you meet? I mean, it's just what a great story, and the two of you together. I didn't know that. I told you before that I was reading David's book separately on a prompt from another friend. And so I'm reading his book with no idea that the two of you were married until that dawned on me through your reading. And I was like, I cannot believe this, but what a marriage made in heaven for sure. It's like unbelievable. So we'll pin that because a second ago you said you mentioned pre-modern. You in talking about education and kind of what's been lost. You said that we even go back and we apply a modern lens to some of the, like Dante's work. And as we read it from a critical analysis perspective that is through a modern lens, and that can be problematic. It's not helpful. We miss so much. Um, I think that you're right in your intuition towards beauty is is a part of what everyone is hungering for, but we don't have language for maybe this giant shift that took place from a pre-modern perspective to a modern perspective. Just if you can unpack that a little bit, because you noted that we're reading pre-modern work from a modern lens, and that when we do that, we miss something. What is it that we're missing?
Well, one book that really helped for me nail it is John Milbank's book, Religion and Social Theory. And he said this in 1991. Alasdair MacIntyre said something similar in After Virtue in 1981, that modern social theory and modern philosophy largely argued that power, not love, is the basis of all reality. So rather than seeing inequality and suffering as fundamentally the result of human waywardness, human sinfulness spilling over into bad behaviors individually or bad structures, modern social theory posited that actually power and conflict is the basis of all reality. And so for thinkers like Karl Marx or Adorno, I mean, Karl Marx actually still believed in a utopia beyond all this. But a few generations later, thinkers like Foucault or Adorno, people often affiliated with critical theory. What does critical theory mean? That we have to unmask the falsity, the pretensions, the power struggles. And what do we do when we unmask it? We might get a glimpse of another way of being, but we don't get an opportunity to transform that basic reality. We just repeat the cycle of conflict. And what ends up happening is that one of the basic tenets then of salvation history, that we're moving kind of like, think of like DNA, right? That history is kind of concentric circles, but it has an endpoint, right? That it's going somewhere. Instead of that, because what we have, I think, in salvation history is this concept of a love that is stronger than any power or conflict, that's pulling us somewhere. And that has been lost. And so instead, we're just in a kind of one-dimensional cycle with really no way out.
Mm.
And I could go into a lot more details about that, as I already mentioned a couple of books that hit on it. But what I think that loss of hope that so many people have is fundamentally the result of a worldview where we're stuck in conflict and there's no way out. Now, I've been lucky enough, because of my background and my work in Latin America, to spend time in small villages in Haiti or small villages in Guatemala or Nicaragua. And there I encountered a very different worldview. It's not that people in rural Haiti or rural Nicaragua don't know that they're living in poverty and don't desire something greater, but they haven't imbibed this kind of Gnostic dualism that material conditions are determine your interior life, and that ultimately your only freedom is maybe like Nietzsche says, that the only kind of real freedom in this kind of crazy world is to just dominate other people the most you can. They haven't bought into that. They still think that basically we are a person on a journey who's fallen in sinfulness, that yes, we are living the consequences of other people's sin, but also our own sin. And they know that in the beauty of nature or in the beauty of love, they're participating in something that really transcends our differences. And because that being exists, that's why you can have hope, even in the midst of poverty or warfare.
Yeah, I imagine as I listen to you that you have power here and you have beauty here. And I'm stuck between these two. And I want to believe that the nature of reality is love and not power. But I'm concerned that I'll be, or I'm fearful that I'll be disappointed. how do you think beauty is that signal of transcendence, or that thing that says, and I think it is, you pointed at that beauty points towards a reality that is love, not power. But what do you say to the person that says, that's Zach, that's great and it's wonderful and fluffy, but it's subjective, and beauty is really in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is really subjective. So your intuition that beauty points beyond itself to a reality of love is just your subjective thinking, because you're that guy. But reality really is power, and that's objectively, we can demonstrate that. What do you say to that person who says, "Yeah, I get you that
Mm.
beauty would point beyond itself to love, not power, but beauty's ultimately subjective"?
So when people say something like beauty is ultimately subjective, they can often, sometimes that means different things. For some people, that simply means that we have a personal response to beauty. And I'm not opposed to that. But somebody who tells me that they can demonstrate that power is real and that beauty is not tied to anything real, they're making a really strong philosophical statement, whether they're aware of it or not. And it's a philosophical statement that is dualistic in the sense that we can know for certain about the material world, and nothing that is invisible or unseen can be known with certainty. And as religious historian Carlos Eyre has written about, this is precisely the opposite of what most people believed until the Enlightenment. And what I also try to get across to people is like, well, it's not just a debate between your philosophical system that's dualistic and mine that's enchanted, right, or religious. How do human beings actually live? And so a lot of my work has been on suffering and resilience. So, what do you say to somebody who thinks that they can still feel the presence of their deceased loved one? Is that just a neurological um, spark that creates a sense of comfort because we are evolutionarily disposed to think that we have eternal life, so we can care better for our infants, so that our infants become better? Oh, sorry, better what? What are my infants supposed to become better at?
Mm,
Are they supposed to become better at Übermenschen?
mm,
Are they supposed to become better warriors? Or are they supposed to become better, you know, servants of others? And if they're supposed to become better servants of others, well, why? I mean, why? We're all just going to go under the ground. Where does your moral judgment come from? And so what I think Alasdair MacIntyre spells out so quickly is that human life and human practice, people act like moral judgments are true.
mm.
And if you want to test that out, I use Jonathan Haidt's approach. Don't ask people about what they think is good. People really don't like it if you don't agree with their moral judgments about what is bad.
Mm.
So if art is purely subjective, then are all moral judgments purely subjective? Is all judgment, right? The word judge, is all judgment subjective?
Mm.
And I got to tell you, people really don't want to think that way. And outside of a couple of academic departments at a couple of prestigious universities, people don't think that way. And it's a dangerous way to think. I remember seeing N.T. Wright come to Yale. He's a famous Anglican theologian, and he debated a philosopher who teaches a class on death. And he's an atheistic materialist. And he's totally philosophically consistent that when we die, we just go back into the ground. And he's stuck to his principles. But I thought N.T. Wright asked him a great question. Have you ever experienced joy?
Hmm.
You know what he said? He's, well, of course I have. But there's no point in thinking about it because it doesn't fit with my presuppositions about what we can say anything true about.
Mm.
He admitted it. I mean, I don't want to exactly quote him, but that was the essence. So, in order to stick to this idea that nothing about beauty is subjective, nothing about judgment is subjective, there's also nothing good to propose. So, I try to help people to see that one can say that beauty is objective in the sense that it's leading us to something that's true, while also upholding that there is the spark of the creator in that work. And for that, I use Thomas Aquinas or Brad Elliott's book about Thomas Aquinas and art to say that what makes art part of objective truth is that art and beauty, beautiful things, reveal to us the order of the universe. So, for example, the beautiful cathedral, which they call a chapel, but it's a cathedral at Princeton University, there's harmony and proportion that correspond to mathematical principles. So when I say beauty is objective, it's not just that I think a Giotto painting is nice to look at, but the Giotto painting is laid out according to certain principles so that what he paints meets our eyes, literally meets our eyes in a way that we can take it in. Whereas a postmodern painting where the human figure, well, you wouldn't know it's a human figure unless someone told you it's a human figure. Half the time it doesn't look like a human figure. Our eyes don't perceive the clarity of that image. There's no message coming to us, but we're supposed to think that this is a body and we're supposed to think that that's a person, but there aren't always faces and there aren't always bodies. So that kind of art represents something, but the thing isn't there. Whereas what Thomas Aquinas says, or what the tradition of Visio Divina says, is that images are supposed to present us something on a literal plane and then elevate our gaze to perceive a deeper reality behind it. And my point is that philosophically, this is what human beings do. We look at the material world and we read symbolic meaning, but that symbolic meaning can't be cut off from our common sense perceptions. This is one of the main points of Thomas Aquinas. Let's get back to our senses.
Mm. I love that because again, we feel the pressure from the elite in academia that say to you or even laugh or mock you if you say that thing that common sense says is beautiful. If I'm drawn toward that and I would say that is beauty, there is a voice out here that mocks you for that and says you must recognize this disfigured thing, this thing that is a nothing. You have to say that that's beauty. And I love the way David did that in his book. I mean, just so helpful in the way of beauty and saying beauty and proportion, and there's an objective nature to it. So yeah, it's a double book promotion because you got to get both books. But it was so helpful, and it can be so helpful. And I know I told you we were going to stick to 40 minutes, so I want to be careful of your time. But I have to ask you because you mentioned nothingness and nothing. And I think that you have a section where you call this out. And I thought this was brilliant because of what so many young people are facing in the malaise or the boredom or the lack of engagement. I just talked to a friend who's a teacher and I said, what's the number one problem with your students? And he said, it's a lack of engagement. They don't care and their parents can't motivate them to care. And they're just even really well-resourced schools like you're pointing to, the kids just don't, there's a loss of engagement. And you call out that boredom is a symptom of the worship of nothingness in one of your chapters. And I circled that whole section and thought, wow, boredom is a symptom of a culture that worships nothingness. Can you say more about that?
I believe I first encountered that idea in the writings of Luigi Giussani, who was an Italian Catholic priest who did ministry with young people in Italy in the 1950s. He was also a really brilliant scholar who knew very well what Nietzsche had said and the sort of the iron cage, as Max Weber talked about it. And so this meaninglessness, also Augusto Del Noce, an Italian philosopher, writes about this. Um, the meaninglessness is a sense that at the core of our being is simply a material reality, right? Or something we can fully direct and control. And the boredom I'm talking about is an existential boredom. It's not knowing the greatness of our calling. Because, and this struck me, right? Because again, I mostly work with young people who have the world at their feet. They've gotten into elite schools. And if they didn't already come from an elite family, they got a ticket to the rest of their life because their degree says the flagship state university of their state or the Ivy League or, Pepperdine. They have an alumni network. I mean, they got the world at their feet, right? But they have existential boredom. They don't know the greatness of their being. And so, what I think that boredom is, just like I, as a young person, wanted to be a warrior, like, Joan of Arc, young people long to participate in something grand. And for some people, that something grand is eco destruction, blowing up oil fields because oil is bad. Well, what happens when they do that? They feel like they're participating in a transformation of the world as it is. Well, what we need to propose to students is that there's a way to live a life that's grand, that's not destructive. Because if you only know how to tear down oil fields, what are you going to put in its place? And what I propose is that young people participate, find people. It's what I love about the Acton Institute, which you mentioned. They have a summer program for people on the principles of kind of Catholic social teaching and economics. And they always highlight the person who started 7 fast food chains and has a program to train workers coming out of jail to lift them up to the managerial level and help them become entrepreneurs, right? People who step into that darkness and don't destroy, but who build. That's why when I went to sociology for a PhD, I thought a social justice warrior was like Mother Teresa. Um, why? Because she went into the poor neighborhoods and she lifted the poor up. And people made fun of her because she didn't change the economic structures of inequality. And I'm like, well, you're sitting here in Princeton drinking a latte. How much inequality are you really fighting? So that what I have seen is that, and look, this is really sad, but what I've seen is that people have a lot of high aspirations to change other people and change the world, and they burn out. And after they burn out, they burn in. They take down the people around them. They don't live up to their mission anymore. So if you want to have a grand mission in life, you've got to have an interior life and not only an exterior life. This is the message that I want to give young people. Yes, to their grand aspirations, but you have to work on your interior life.
Yeah. It's so incredible to hear you talk about that and know that this sloth, this seventh deadly sin, of sloth and acedia, and a failure to become, a failure to participate in what we are called to. People feel it, and they feel like there is no exit, there's no way out of this other thing. And so I love that there's voices like yours pointing and saying that's not the default assumption of most of the world and the world's history. Like there is a different way to imagine reality and to participate in it and offer a hopeful way forward. And I think that you're so well positioned to do this. And I'm just grateful, deeply grateful for the work you're doing. I could eat up your whole afternoon peppering you with questions, but The Wounds of Beauty is the book, and it's beautiful. The Wounds of Beauty. It's 7 dialogues with different voices. Dana Joya, who's been on this podcast before, is one of those. So we love Dana's voice. But go get the book, whether you're a pastor or an educator or you are educating around a dining room table. The Wounds of Beauty. It's essential, I think, for our moment that we have this dialogue. And Margarita, you've done a wonderful job giving us a resource that's really accessible. So thank you for that. For everybody listening, that our belief is that you have to have an up before you can have an in, and that will lead you out. And I love what you said, that you will burn out if you start with an outward vision and try to work yourself you'll work yourself to death. There has to be an inward, and there can't be that without a beautiful transcendence. So, Margarita, maybe what we can do is put a I said this with David too, that we're going to have to put a comma because there's so many things that we could say. But where can people find your book? Like if they want to support the work of Scala Foundation, if they want to continue to hear your voice and kind of follow the path that you're helping create for us, where can they go? Where would you direct people?
Please visit Scala's website, scalafoundation.org. Our blog is updated regularly with articles, resources, images. You'll also find there resources for educators, links to the books, and subscribe to our newsletter, because that's how you hear about upcoming events and newly released resources. We also have a YouTube channel, Scala Foundation YouTube. And if you want to see and hear about the great art, that's where I would direct you. Look at our videos on the YouTube channel. And finally, you can follow me on social media, Margarita Mooney Clayton on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. So I post there regularly. We would love to hear from you directly. If you have a question, just send us write to us through Scala's website. And if we can help you, we would be glad to. We're always looking for anyone who wants to donate, donations of any amount. You can see that on Scala's website. We do have a group of recurring donors that we call the Fellowship of the Annunciation, which allows us to direct resources to young artists and musicians who are in training. And then we bring those young artists and musicians to our events. So there's a variety of ways to get involved. Please also just keep us in your prayers. I work with young people who are hurting, but seeking the truth. And we need to be united in prayer for each other's work, and to remember that even if we're far away or we've never met, wishing me well in your prayers would be so appreciated. And if you've listened to me, please know that I really value your everyday work as a mother, as an educator, as a media consultant, as a writer, whatever it is that you do. If you're doing it for the glory of God and in the presence of God, He will bless you. And if you don't always know that, that's okay. We are human beings. We have to trust in God.
What a great last word. So thank you so much for that. And I just encourage everybody listening, get the book, The Wounds of Beauty, start there, and then do follow Margarita's social media, engage the Scala Foundation, pray, and let's do exactly what Margarita just suggested. I think there's more and more of us cheering each other on. And so please go cheer on Margarita's work and the work of Scala Foundation. Margarita, thank you so much for taking
Thank you, Seth.
time. I'm grateful.
Great to be here.